What is up, guys? So today we are back with another deep dive looking at a Pokemon that has been quite highly requested. Today we're actually looking at Kadabra. A lot of you guys have actually been talking about Kadabra in the comments section below, so I figured I'd take this opportunity to actually look into Kadabra and see what Kadabra actually has going for it. So Kadabra is a pure Psychic type Pokemon, maxing out at level 40 with 15s across the board at 2059. That's actually a pretty good CP to max out at, considering it's closer to that 1500 mark than a lot of other Pokemon. So with a 2 on attack, 15 defense, 14 stamina IV spread, at level 27 you can actually hit 1499, which is not too shabby. That's a pretty good IV spread there, giving you the maximum stat product out of your Kadabra possible while remaining inside of the Great League. So according to my spreadsheets and all my numbers, Kadabra actually does rank 70th in bulk and 63rd in stat products. So not the highest numbers there. I mean, there's roughly like 90 some participants in the actual Nightmare Cup, so pretty low. But we know that that doesn't necessarily dictate how good we do. It all comes down to our moves, which we'll get to in just a second. So our actual base stats here, you can see that Kadabra has a whopping 232 in the attack stat, which is freaking huge. Then we actually have 117 on defense and 120 in stamina, and you can kind of tell that is not the ideal stat distribution that we're looking for a great PvP Pokemon. Unfortunately, all of our CP does come from our attack stat. Even with a 0 on our attack IV, the CP formula is just going to really be weighted towards the attack, which means we just don't get as much out of our Kadabra as we would like. Now, moving on to our moves here. So looking into Kadabra, he actually only has 5 moves total, and I really started to figure out that early on, this is basically a war between Psycho Cut and Confusion. So let's figure out why. So Psycho Cut actually gains 4.5 energy per turn. Holy cow, that's huge. It only does 1.5 damage per turn though, but after stab it does get boosted to a 1.8. So in kind of like the complete opposite, Confusion only gains 3 energy per turn, which is very respectable, but it actually does 4 damage per turn, and after stab ends up hitting 4.8 damage per turn, which is huge. So we know that Confusion is a big deal because every Pokemon in the Nightmare Cup that has Confusion already has their foot in the door. They only need a couple of other things that really set them up as a great candidate for any team, as long as they carry that Confusion move. But Psycho Cut, this is interesting. Having 4.5 energy per turn, I wonder, like, how good can we actually do with that? Well, that's kind of where this deep dive ended up going. I actually have Psycho Cut and Confusion as 2 different movesets here, and I wanted to take a look at both of those and figure out which one was better. But before we do that, we actually need to look at these charge moves to figure out which charge moves we're actually going to carry on our Kadabra here. So our first move is actually Psybeam, which is a stab candidate move, costing 60 for 70 damage at a 1.17 damage per energy ratio. After you do factor in stab, it actually does get 84 damage for a 1.4 damage per energy ratio. Then we actually have Dazzling Gleam, which is a fairy move, which is a nice addition, costing 70 for 110 damage at a 1.57 damage per energy ratio. No stab bonus there. Shadow Ball actually costing 55 for 100 damage at a 1.82 damage per energy ratio, which of course does not get stab as it is a ghost type move, but still, that's a big payoff right there. 55 energy for 1.82 is, that's amazing. So out of those 3 moves, I actually think that Psybeam is the weakest of them all. Dazzling Gleam is going to be able to hit a lot of stuff for neutral damage at worst, and then Shadow Ball actually hits a lot of things for neutral damage at worst. Whereas Psybeam, it's a high cost for such a poor payoff. It's really not worth it in my opinion. Dazzling Gleam costs more than Psybeam, but it gets way more efficiency out of that energy that you just spent than Psybeam does. So I definitely felt like Psybeam was kind of the weakest performer out of these 3 moves, so I decided to go with Dazzling Gleam and Shadow Ball for each of these moves. So when it comes down to Psycho Cut versus Confusion, this is kind of what I found. Psycho Cut, basically with its massive energy gain, allows you to focus more on your charge moves. It allows you to put that energy to really good use while basically not doing any damage whatsoever. And when we rely only on our charge moves, we end up having some really weird interactions when it comes to shielding. In the confusion area though, we actually end up not relying so much on our charge moves. They're more of a nice helpfulness to our moveset, but they're not necessarily like the main thing that we're going for. It's not like we only can rely on our charge moves. Confusion is a great move, well-rounded stats for such a hard-hitting move. It can really target a lot of different things and do really well for Kadabra in a lot of situations. So let's go back to Psycho Cut, Dazzling Gleam, and Shadow Ball and look at some shield situations here. So in our first situation, a 0 versus 0 shield situation, or a closing type situation if you will, 51.4% of those matchups go to Kadabra, which is pretty good. That's not too shabby. When both I as Kadabra and my opponent don't have to worry about shields, we actually can rely heavily on a ton of this neutral damage and do pretty well with it. Now in a 2 versus 0 shield situation, we actually can do pretty good because we have all the shield advantage and our opponent doesn't have any shields, and all we're doing is relying solely on these charge moves here. We win 71.4% of those matchups, and dark types are really the only things that we have a ton of trouble with. We beat more than 2/3 of the cup, but the darks are really what's getting to us there. Now in the 0 versus 2 shield situation, so when I don't have any shields and my opponent has 2 shields, this is kind of where it gets interesting because we solely rely on these charge moves, and that's basically, I mean, when the opponent has 2 shields, they have 2 chances to mitigate tons of our damage. Because we're only doing 1.8 damage neutrally, that's really, really poor. So when we focus solely on these charge moves and they have all the shields, we don't win anything. We literally win none of those matchups. That's a hard pill to swallow. Our last scenario is actually the 2 versus 2 shield situation. So in a mock-up like opening type situation, here again we only win 8.6% of those matchups, which is really, really bad. So basically with this moveset, you can see that you focus heavily on these charge moves, and it works out really nice for you if you have the shield advantage or if it's a closing type situation. But in the situations where shields are even, or if they have shield advantage, it goes really, really bad for you. Now let's take a look at Confusion with Dazzling Gleam and Shadow Ball. This one's a little bit more well-rounded. It's a little bit easier to swallow this kind of moveset here. So 0 versus 0, so our closing type situation is 24.3%. Not too shabby. It's not the greatest that we've seen, but it's also not the worst, I don't think. Actually, it might be the worst. In a 2 versus 0 shield situation, so when I have both shields, we actually end up winning 60% in this moveset, but the darks are still basically our biggest issue. Then we go to our 0 versus 2, so when the opponent actually has 2 shields, we actually end up winning 20% rather than the 0%. But the fighters are basically what we are being able to overcome, even though they have both shields. Confusion really does help us win a lot of those matchups. I believe Lucario was the only one that could end up winning against us if they actually had both shields and we didn't have any. Then our last scenario, back to the 2 versus 2, so the opening type situation, we're actually up to 37.1% now, which is not too bad. And that kind of does go to show that we do prefer to open with this moveset rather than close, whereas in the opposite moveset, it was rather closing than opening. So you can kind of see there's a big variance between both movesets, and honestly, for the rest of this video, am going to go with the Confusion moveset. Psycho Cut is extremely enticing because I really do love that kamikaze style play, but it's just too risky to go with Psycho Cut in my opinion. So for the rest of the video, I'm going to be talking about the Confusion, Dazzling Gleam, and Shadow Ball moveset. Now moving on to our board over here, this is the board where we talk about our matchups and our countering type situations. I do want you to keep in mind that all the simulations ran from this point of the video on, or on this board, are done in a 1 shield versus 1 shield to try to give the most evenness to both parties. So our matchups in every deep dive, I end up taking our subject Pokemon, Kadabra today, and I put them up against the top 10 bulkiest Pokemon just to kind of see how they do. Kadabra, whoa. So the only one we actually end up winning against is Wobbuffet. We actually end up losing to Umbreon, Hypno, Claydol, Bronzong, Alolan Raticate, Matang, Slowbro, Slowking, and Grumpig. And this is kind of where you start to see the bad side of Kadabra. So we talked about his base stats a little earlier, and his base stats are really what I think is holding him back. He has so much attack that it really makes him so frail in a lot of matchups that even when it comes to things that shouldn't have any room to beat such a high attack Pokemon like Grumpig, Slowbro, Slowking, I don't think either of those three really have like so much footing that they should just be able to take out Kadabra. But when you start to dig into it, it really starts to show that that attack stat makes so much of your freaking CP that you just have no bulk. You have no footing to stand on when you start getting hit with all these crazy moves. Moving on to our countering section here. So I like to think of this as what should you be focusing on with Kadabra versus what should you be targeting Kadabra with whenever you're building your team. If you're worried about Kadabra, then these are kind of the things that you want to have, versus if you're carrying Kadabra, you kind of want to focus your efforts here. So as far as what you should focus on, definitely focus on the fighting types. In a 1 versus 1 shield situation, you actually beat every single fighting type that there is. Mind you, that is with confusion, keep that in mind. With Psycho Cut, it's a totally different story. So as far as what you should actually bring to counter a Kadabra, this one's pretty cut and dry. Darks are your hard counters. Every dark type Pokemon has such an easy time up against Kadabra. Considering that we're a pure psychic type, we have that weakness. We're just gonna get wrecked by all the dark types. The psychic types though, yeah, we still have a hard time beating any of these psychics, which make them a really good option to actually take out Kadabra. So we actually only end up beating 2 psychic types, Gallade and Wobbuffet. So Gallade is actually a pretty interesting matchup because we actually end up having confusion in this scenario. Gallade also carrying confusion gets to the point where we're taking resisted confusion damage, whereas Gallade is actually taking neutral confusion damage. So we end up being able to just output enough damage. Funny enough though, Gallade still is able to get to Leaf Blade faster than we are able to get to anything. So if the shield situation were even slightly different, we would totally get wrecked by Gallade. But in that 1 versus 1 shield situation, we do actually end up beating Gallade purely off of the fact that confusion ends up doing neutral damage in that matchup rather than a super effective damage. So now let's actually move on to some pros and cons for Kadabra. My only con that I wrote down is that Kadabra's stats are just way too unbalanced for PvP to be a dream for Kadabra here. He's just got so much attack weighted in his CP. It's just too much. He becomes so frail. I'm not kidding. There were matchups where, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was the matchup with Alolan Raticate. If Alolan Raticate is actually carrying Bite in that matchup, Kadabra actually loses after only getting off 4 confusions. Yeah, 4 confusions. Alolan Raticate has the damage output to just completely get rid of Kadabra. In the Umbreon matchup, Kadabra only gets 4 confusions off before Umbreon actually fires off its first foul play. It shields that foul play and then tries to get off a Shadow Ball after 1 more confusion, but ends up dying after only 3 more fast attacks. It has such a hard time overcoming the dark types, especially these bulkier dark types in the cup, that it just makes so hard to recommend. It's so hard to actually recommend Kadabra after doing this deep dive. Now, as far as pros go, I did actually like the fact that we do have decent coverage here. We do have Confusion, which is a boost. We do have Dazzling Gleam, which is nice. And we do have Shadow Ball, which is great. But I don't think that the pros outweigh the cons. I definitely think that it's the opposite for Kadabra here. Our stats are just way too unbalanced for a PvP scenario to actually be recommendable for Kadabra. I just don't think that Kadabra is worth running. I think that you will get wrecked way more often than you would like, and so that is actually it for Kadabra today, guys. I feel like this one was kind of short, but there wasn't too much to really deep dive into Kadabra after looking at the two movesets. That's his biggest thing. He does have two viable movesets in some scenarios. Psycho Cut has insane energy where Confusion actually has really good damage, but that would be up to you guys. If you are still thinking about running Kadabra, please let me know down in the comments. I'd love to see what your full team is to kind of get a feel of, did you build the team around Kadabra? Are you still considering running Kadabra after this video? And how much do you really love Kadabra? So thank you guys so much for watching. Remember that if you like to like videos, you could do that, but if you don't, you could be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in those comments below. You can recommend deep dives if you want them. And until our next video, I will catch you then.